Hello, and welcome to the People Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth, and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larson.
So Heather, hi. Thank you very much for joining us today. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you.
Good. And so I'm over at your new offices now. You've joined Macauer Architects, haven't you, quite recently?
Yeah.
And it's a really amazing spot here. You must be enjoying that kind of transition coming out of McCaslin and a fresh start.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny moment, 10 years in a practice, so big shift from kind of probably something which is more architecture focused to something which is maybe a little bit more, well, it's been really interesting working with Tim, looking at kind of the spaces in between buildings a bit more strongly alongside the architecture, and his experience in master planning has been, really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's good, it's good. And so we met a few years ago, didn't we, when you were at McCaslin's, and along with your architectural work, you've obviously been very active in teaching, and you were the founder of Architects Aware, weren't you, as well, which is an amazing initiative. Why don't you tell everyone a little bit more about Architects Aware and the mission behind it, really?
Yeah, so I guess when I was working at McCaslin, I was doing a lot of the kind of pro bono initiative projects, so that's probably where that started. And one of the projects I did there was a competition around homelessness, so looking at working with the charity New Horizon Youth Centre. The aim of the project was really to help them, use our skills to help them get essentially accommodation. So the idea was, the premise was an architectural competition, which could be utilised. You launch the thing and then it's utilised to essentially be used as collateral for them to then go and get funding. So that's kind of where it started, and that project was supposed to be organised in a few months, and I ended up taking a year because I got quite addicted to it, and we just realised how complicated it is. And I think, for me it was fascinating because architects, generally we're taught to be entrepreneurial, we're taught to, we're well placed to write briefs, but we very rarely get to do it. So actually being right at the front end of the process and using those skills was very kind of empowering, and also working with a wider breadth of people. So working with the charities and kind of really learning from them. For me, it was going from just a relatively close group of people to then be speaking with the deputy mayor about policy and speaking to charities about what they need to develop the brief. And I think the competition result really benefited from that. We had 47 entries. The brief started as something which was architecture and became something which is much more kind of wider. So we asked people to provide a business plan, to look at policy. So working with Deputy Mayor, we were kind of saying, if you challenge affordable housing and you replace affordable housing with the wider issue of housing crisis, and actually say, well, if you replace the element of affordable with something which could be temporary or move on accommodation for people suffering from homelessness, then what does that look like? So it's the kind of design challenge of co-location and dealing with NIMBYism and how these two symbiotic uses could sit together. It's the business case of how those things kind of mutually could support each other. And it's also the kind of care model that wraps around that. So not just the building itself and who it's for, but the how does the thing kind of succeed going forward, and really support the people that live there. So that was maybe slightly naively at the time. I thought, well, this is great. We've got a site from kind of TfL loaned for the purpose of the competition. We've got everybody who is possibly needed to bring this project forward. Whichever architect wins, this will be real. And obviously that didn't happen for various reasons. But the process was so enjoyable, and we learned so much that I just didn't want to stop talking about it. So that was really Architects Aware. So all of the people, the architects, the developers, the charities, the policymakers formed the group. And that group has been, really started with a very simple manifesto, which is, if you put it very basically, like, what would it take to end homelessness, just as a very broad aspiration. But ultimately, it's a group of people who meet and share all of our knowledge, learn together, and then, kind of monitor and campaign together in terms of looking to see how we can change that landscape, so that it isn't, a project which is something which is a one-off, but could become something which is embedded in policy in some way, and actually becomes the norm.
Yeah. So what do you think it would take to end homelessness then? Because it got me thinking about during the pandemic and the Everyone In initiative, where obviously the amazing circumstance we found ourselves in meant that no one was using hotels. So, for a while, for a period of time, there was no or very little homelessness on the streets of London. And obviously that was a moment in time. But what's your view on the broader question about how we might go about that?
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer because, but I think, everyone in is a really good example because ultimately it did something that has never happened in history before. We've known homelessness and lived with homelessness forever, but overnight, as you said, I think it was something like 92% of rough sleeping, I think that's the right statistic, was eliminated overnight. And that shows a very straightforward response to a policy condition. Obviously that comes with other things, the unreported statistics, which is rough sleeping might have been eliminated, but other areas of homelessness were, enhanced. So youth homelessness became more dramatic because that was dealing with a condition on the street. So what would it take to end homelessness? I think, the think tank and the way that we look at it is that it needs to be a kind of multi-sector, multi-skilled approach of people coming together. It's super complicated. And a kind of siloed approach is never going to achieve it. So it needs to be looked at from lots of different angles and together. But clearly, policy has a massive role to play, as is seen from the Everyone In scheme.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it reminds me, we were talking just before the podcast about the work of Indy Johar at Dark Maths Lab and Architecture 00. And he often talks about kind of systems change, doesn't he? And this idea about sort of trying to look at systems from policy down to design, down to people, communities, culture, and it's obviously very complicated. But trying to influence that system in some way, in some small part, if we can, through the work you're doing and others, is quite an interesting kind of an impactful way to spend your time, isn't it?
And I think it's, Indy's work we're all very admirable of. I mean, I think he said to me once, I was talking about the research, and I will probably misquote him now in a much less eloquent way, but he said, cast the problem in a sort of wider net and say, if you look at homelessness and the homeless person and all of the conditions that result in them being there. I mean, we all know landlords' price increases have been up 66%, I think it is, or something in the last year. Youth homelessness, I think, has gone up. I've got it written down here somewhere because it changes every day, but it's 40% in the last 5 years. And I think the last reported statistic was 120,000 people reported to local authorities. That's just a reported statistic. But Indy, it's a kind of side comment, but he talked about, what if that homeless person is the future Einstein? So he looks at it more in that kind of like social collateral, and it is very, that kind of wider context is super interesting as well.
Yeah, and he applies that kind of thinking to lots of different use cases, doesn't he? And sticking with homelessness, the cost of a homeless person being on the street, not just the cost to the individual, but the overall systems cost of that in terms of the costs that go around that person, kind of keeping them in care or trying to help them get off the street is really quite staggering. And he references in that Greenpeace talks about the cost of a can of Coke versus the cost of an apple, and if you were to tax the can of Coke, given all of its impact on people's lives, trips to the dentist, increased diabetes, obesity, etc. The cost of that can of Coke as a system cost would be, astronomical compared to the cost of the apple. And so if we can kind of begin to maybe place different weightings on the cost of maybe getting people off the streets, in systems terms, it's actually probably quite a marginal cost compared to obviously the impact that it's having them being on the streets.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just coming back to the competition, because I think that underpins the thinking for a lot of the work that we've done at Architects Aware. But that was exactly the thinking around having a business model, which is, every homeless person that is put into substandard, temporary or often long-term accommodation comes at a huge cost. It's, a lot of the time it's B&Bs, like places that are not set up to cater for this and don't give any kind of quality of life through no fault of efforts of trying, but because there's not better options available. So, that money could be much better spent. And I think, the competition looked at that to say, well, this idea of people being completely separate, costing a lot of money and actually not getting benefit from it means it's not just the cost of that stay, but it's also the fact that you're not really solving the problem of people coming back into the system. So it's not kind of fit for purpose. So yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah. And it's so multi-layered, isn't it? Because there's, even within homelessness, there's different definitions of people who are experiencing homelessness of different stages. And I was looking on your website before this talk, and you've got a very kind of nice matrix of the different kind of types of homeless people, from people who have maybe experienced living on the streets for 10 plus years to people who are experiencing very kind of immediate kind of reasons why they're on the streets, whether that's a breakup in a relationship or whether it's kind of, as you say, increasing rents or whatever it may be. And they may be kind of work ready, in inverted commas, and trying to sort of address the different kind of conditions and different people in an appropriate way, because it's not kind of just a case of almost maybe the stereotypical view of someone sleeping on the streets, who may have sort of certain mental health or maybe social issues that they're dealing with. It's much more complex than that, and it covers families, it covers individuals. Before this talk, I was on Shelter's website having a look at some statistics, and as you say, they all move around very readily, but these were from January 2023. And so this is just for the UK. So it's saying that there's over 270,000 recorded people suffering from homelessness in England at this moment in time, including over 120,000 children, which is amazing. So what that equates to is one person in every 208 is without a home, which is kind of pretty staggering, really. And when you break that down, and again, obviously there's different figures for this, but these are from Shelter. If you look at temporary accommodation element of that, so there's 250,000 people in temporary accommodation, and this has risen by 74% in the last 10 years. Yeah, which is pretty remarkable, really. So this kind of there's a real need, isn't there? So we talk about housing crisis, affordability crisis, and that is everything from obviously building new homes, but dealing with some of these kind of really immediate issues as well. So your work in architecture, talking about developing new homes, you mentioned to me before that you're working on a large project now that's bringing forwards thousands of homes. And how do you think the need to build ties into this piece as well?
Well, I think ultimately, as you said, we have a huge housing crisis, and that, we talk a lot about housing first, and I think everyone agrees that that's, the best strategy, and it's been proven in lots of other countries. But in absence of having enough housing, the current model to essentially focus primarily on affordable housing, which is not really inclusive of all types of housing situations. It is changing. There's new funding is coming forward, which looks at other specialist housing typologies. But I think it's, with the shortage of things being built, we do need to look at the problems that are in front of us. And with cost of living, rapidly escalating rents, I think it's very easy to look at homelessness as kind of otherness and something which is detached from us. And actually, we're all 3 steps from that, and it could happen to anybody. And when you start to look at it in that way, and just coming back to the points about kind of diversity of offer, this idea that there's one size fits all when we're all human, and so why should it be any different? It starts to play into the way you think about it. And really, it is about kind of understanding people in the core of any design, and just making spaces that really consider people from all backgrounds and demographics, and really thinks about what they need rather than a kind of simplified solution, which ultimately won't result, particularly with youth homelessness or people with particular needs, in them actually moving forward and having a kind of dignified life. So I just don't think it's any different. I think there's just less of it, so it requires more focus because they're underrepresented.
Yeah, no, I agree. And clearly in everything you do, you kind of ooze of empathy and compassion and doing things for other people, which is an amazing trait to have. And take me back a little bit to you personally, kind of where do you think these kind of values come from for you?
Well, I could talk about this for hours. I guess, my whole family is engaged in kind of various mental health backgrounds. So my sister's a therapist. My mum's worked with people in kind of homelessness and mental health and various different things. I mean, I myself at different points in my life probably was not close to being homeless, but definitely have been in a world of kind of not feeling like I have a home for different reasons. And I think comes back to the point about everybody, is 3 steps from homelessness. I think it's just very easy to forget that. So I think growing up in those circumstances, it just makes you want to help. And my uncle actually also was homeless. So I remember growing up and being 14, him coming into our house for a week and physically seeing him be uncomfortable being in a house. He was more comfortable outside the house than inside the house. And that was quite a kind of eye-opening moment of just, people are very different, and life circumstances or what is comfortable for one person is very, very different from another person. And I think it just, that kind of drives me to really think about the spaces we're designing and really them being fit for purpose for more than just a generic typology of person.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. And did that kind of inspire you to go into architecture then? Was that part of your decision making, or?
I kind of went into architecture by accident. I thought I was going to be a filmmaker or a set designer. And it's just, as I did an art foundation, as I kind of explored all of these things, I just realized spatial design was better for me. So it's been an evolving thing. And I think actually the pandemic in the last few years has been a moment of, I probably always kept the stuff I was just talking about quite separate, but bringing it together and really understanding like you as a human and how that should and could come together with architecture and actually makes the practice more meaningful is a very recent thing. Because I guess it's been hard to get comfortable with that, but it's very kind of empowering now that I'm doing that.
Yeah. I think, putting people at the center of every decision that we make, in architecture, design, the built environment it's really important. And it sounds really logical, but it's not actually, necessarily how people are trained or kind of how the industry operates in that sense. And I think we're getting better at that. I don't know if you have a view on that point.
Yeah, I mean, we at Macau have been developing a pro bono charity project, which we're looking at designing compassionate mental health spaces. And just a few weeks ago, we went to a compassionate mental health conference, which was very interesting. You really had to open yourself out and we did all these kind of listening circles, all these different things. And I've forgotten the question now. I've completely... What were we just talking about?
I was going to ask you. You mentioned listening circles there.
Yeah,
Talk me through that, because that is, as an idea when you talk about, listening to local community groups, to designing with people. How important do you think kind of listening is, and what talk to me about listening circle?
So this, I'll go back to the project to explain how we can tie it back to architecture. So we went there as architects. We're looking to design a compassionate mental health space for people suffering from psychosis. So we were trying to learn about these new methods of therapy, and it was a kind of research exercise, but actually we ended up getting completely immersed in it. And we went thinking, okay, well, we're going to present some of our architectural ideas about this community. And we completely changed in the course of 2 days and being immersed in this experience, the way that we did that research, which was amazing. So we said, actually, we're not going to present anything. We're going to have a big open conversation. We're not going to sit here with slides. We're not going to have slides at all, which as an architect, that's quite a hard thing to do. And we're not going to sit with us at the front and everyone, sat in front of us. And we're going to have a very big circle of chairs. And we are going to talk about ideas and see what comes out of it. And 3 hours of filming later, it was a much more experiential thing of saying, well, what if this environment feels like this? Or what if the arrival feels like this? Or what do you think you need? And everyone there was from, different backgrounds. So you had people that had lived in institutions or about to go into them, parents, all of that stuff. And that diverse range of voices, suddenly by having that circle, you made everybody comfortable to speak. And it was just like a really fascinating way of doing it. I mean, we come close, not come close, but we do elements of that in architecture, but it does very much feel a lot of the time like you present something and then you get feedback. And that in itself has a certain hierarchy to it. So I think actually like the physical space and how you sit and the way you pose the question, where it's actually, is it really a question or is it a conversation, can make a massive difference to what you get back from that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was actually about to say to you, it's about posing questions, isn't it, rather than solutions. It's a very different kind of approach, really, and really kind of not just asking the question for the sake of asking it and really listening, as you're saying, to what comes back and trying to understand that different person's perspective and where they're coming from, which is probably or could well be quite different from the design team's view of life.
Yeah, and I think as architects, we have this amazing ability, or I guess the skill of the architect, or should be, is to be propositional. So here's a bunch of problems. What do you think a solution might be? And you get quite skilled or set in kind of doing that as a process, but you can lose things. And I think coming back to the earlier point about brief writing and being entrepreneurial and kind of the ability to be compassionate and speak to people in a different way and actually make solutions that are fit for purpose and really thinks about the way people live and occupy the world. It's just stepping back from that and thinking like, well, how do we actually achieve this in a different way?
Yeah. And how do you think, or do you think the process that we go through, particularly in the early design stages of projects, do you feel that needs to change or could change further than it already is?
Do you talk about the early design stages?
Yeah.
I think going back to the brief, and this is something that's been fantastic at Macau with, stepping back and going really from early stages of master planning and brief writing, but applying it to really interrogating the brief and being involved in the brief from an early stage. So you're kind of setting a framework which allows for a different type of exploration, because if things are too narrowed down, then you're already setting your course. So I think giving yourself the freedom to explore something a bit more slowly at the beginning and being open to different outcomes, even if ultimately you're still going to have to reduce it down to what you probably know the brief will be, at least it gives you that kind of framework to return to when you're exploring questions in a slightly different way. Yeah,
so just sort of taking that time really at the start of the process to go through this as opposed to necessarily jumping in. And obviously it's very difficult on projects when there's a whole kind of system around why that brief is what it is, whether it's the policy side of things, the planning context, or whether it's kind of from the commercial side in terms of what the brief is coming from the client, and trying to kind of sit within that and ensure that some of these themes kind of get voiced really at the start of projects is really important, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think seeing, kind of setting it, as we were talking about earlier, in a sort of wider kind of systems-based context, you can see opportunities early on. So, perhaps you can enhance that brief, and later down the line when things get set, it's harder to do that. So having conversations, and actually I think having a wider group of voices earlier in the process means those opportunities can really underpin the way you're thinking, rather than becoming a bolt-on later down the line, which is quite frustrating, because you might start to explore something but never really kind of get into it in a way that is more meaningful and basically part of the project rather than, as they say, an add-on.
Yeah. And there's a real richness that can come from that, isn't there? If you can do that in the right way. So I think, talking about, we've kind of talked about ESG and, without talking about ESG, which is kind of quite refreshing, I think. Do you have any other comments around ESG in terms of what you think about, the way that we're bringing forward those types of discussions?
I mean, I think with anything, any new, let's call it new topic, to just talk about it is a good thing, because it gets it into the world as something which becomes more comfortable. But ultimately, a lot of the time with these things, you end up with people, not necessarily people looking for shortcuts, but a little bit of a tick box outcome. And I think for me, I just find it much easier when talking about any of these things to just really, really simplify it and be like, what are we ultimately trying to achieve? And it's better places for people and more diversity, more inclusivity. So that, people are individual. So the minute you kind of have a unified solution, you lose the capacity in some ways to kind of achieve that. It becomes a bit kind of monocultured. And I think, to just be super simple and say, well, who's this project for? What is going to make their lives better? And therefore, what do I need to do, even if it doesn't tick that box? I prefer to look at it that way.
Yeah, no, well, I agree, and I do too. And I think if you can actually focus on, well, what is the actual positive impact we can have from now, whether that's engaging with people or whether it's actual kind of initiatives on the site in a permanent or meanwhile way during the design process, as well as then kind of looking forward into the project itself, approaching it much more from a impact first rather than kind of policy or governance first, I think is quite important. And I must admit, I also struggle with the notion of kind of quantifying everything back into a kind of a social value in a financial sense. It's kind of doesn't quite feel right, but I understand why people are looking to kind of measure things and to report things in that way. But some of this stuff, you can't quite sort of rationalize it in that way, can you?
I mean, I think it's helpful to have a framework, but then to not just rely on that being the only way to approach it. So you can always kind of try and be more bespoke and specific. Like one example is as part of Architects Wear, three of us, so myself, Miranda, McLaren and Polina Penjiva, who both work at Morrison Company, we developed a set of guidelines. So we got REBA funding, and what we were trying to do comes back to the policy point, but set a framework for temporary specialist accommodation for people suffering from homelessness. We started from, the obvious point, which is, it's something like London Design Housing Guidelines, because if you look at regular housing, there's a range of regulations that kind of control and make sure they meet certain criteria. But the only thing monitoring temporary homeless accommodation is really, is it overcrowded? Is it going to set on fire? And the regulations haven't changed since like Victorian times. So we started from a quantitative perspective, and then we actually said, well, no, I think we're going to do a qualitative design guidelines. And I remember there being a turning point when we were doing our research of saying, we don't want to talk about, things which can be kind of minimized. We want to talk about the way that these spaces make you feel, because it needs to be a kind of, a supportive space. So when we were talking about the bathrooms, rather than talking about things through pretentious design words, we said, well, actually it needs to be dignified. When we talk about the arrival space, we need to talk about it being welcoming. Mm-hmm. And I remember this really big conversation we had with the charity. It was DePaul and New Horizon Youth Centre. And we were talking about the kitchen as being like the dining room being the kind of foundational space where everyone comes together. It's a universal language of food. It doesn't matter where you're from or your level of language or your background. You can communicate with food without even needing to talk. So that's a very healing thing, particularly for kind of 18 to 25-year-olds. And we were wanting to call it the banquet hall. And we just got told off for being ridiculously pretentious and arrogant. It's like, it's a kitchen table. So why do architects feel the need to, glamorize these things? And it was a very humbling but very helpful exercise to be like, what are we doing? And this isn't inclusive language, and I think it's those kind of conversations and the ways of looking at the world through lots of different lenses is just really helpful. Because you can often forget that you've had years of training and certain ways of talking about design, but actually that can become a little bit separate and not helpful.
Yeah, exactly. Less jargon and more kind of human in that sense.
Yes. Yeah.
Good. Well, Heather, that's really fascinating discussion there. We have a bit of a tradition on the end of this podcast. So our previous guest asked a question for the next guest, and I will ask you to ask one for the following guest coming after this. So our previous guest asked, which is quite a difficult question, this one, but if there was one thing about the industry you could change right now, what would it be?
Oh, it's such a difficult question.
I know.
This is a bit of a naive answer, but I think it would just be to allow ourselves more time. Which is, I know that's almost like a very childish answer, but I think, everybody wants to do all of these things. And if we could find a way to facilitate that, I think time or maybe that's a kind of incentive to ourselves to make time, actually. So
Yeah. No, I think it's a really good answer, and it chimes with everything we've been talking about, doesn't it? About giving these ideas, particularly in the early stages of projects, the space that they need to kind of mature.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Heather. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for listening to the People Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.